Welcome, Pablo, from New York, 6 a.m. Thank you for being awake with us. Well, as much as we know you as an artist indeed, you're also an author, an educator. You were head of public programs at the education department of the Guggenheim in New York, assistant professor at the College of Performing Arts at the New School in New York, and director of adult and academic programs at the MoMA. You are widely considered a pioneering figure in the field of art and socially engaged art. You have exhibited and have performed extensively, not only in biennials in museums worldwide, and you wrote this really special book titled Education for Socially Engaged Art in 2011, it was. Many of us also know you by your cartoons or artoons, which I always enjoy very much. Well, the floor is yours. We're all ears. You made a special keynote address for us entitled From Conflict to Resolution Through the Not Knowing. Thank you, Pablo. We're all ears.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for having me. I'm very grateful to Manifesta for inviting me to speak to all of you today. I will speak about the relationship between art and trauma, and in particular, how artists can use the tools of education both as a system of research and engagement and as a way to make artworks that can help at times in participatory ways to help us understand and process our lived conflicts. I will also talk about how this process involves a journey, which is real or can be metaphorical. I will now share my screen. Can you allow me to share my screen, please? Can you allow me, please, to share my own screen, please? Thank you. I would like to start by talking about a Russian fairy tale. It's an anonymous Russian fairy tale that I would often hear as a child. I would read as a child. It's known as Prince Ivan, the girl witch, and the little sun sister. It's a story of a prince, Prince Ivan, who he has a king and a queen as parents, who later learns by a wise old man that he will have a sister who will devour their parents. He is advised to escape from the kingdom because of this baby witch is going to devour their family, which she does after he runs away. He escapes to the end of the world, where he arrives in a beautiful palace in the clouds where the little sister of the sun lives. Happy to have a friend and companion, the little sister takes care of him. The prince, however, is tormented by having escaped and decides to return to the kingdom, where he encounters that his family indeed has vanished. And she transforms into the sister transforms into a large monster that later pursues him to the end of the world, where he arrives to the little sisters of the sun's tower and eventually is saved by her. The evil sister grinds her teeth in anger, and her teeth break, forcing her to spend the rest of her life eating soups. This Russian folktale contains many elements that are very typical of the structure of most narratives of any country. The Soviet folklorist Vladimir Prop, he in the 1920s developed a, a structure of understanding of how folk tales function and what are the prototypical components of the folk tale. Here's an example of like one of the various elements that he describes as important and common on folk tales. There's usually a moment of interdiction, a prohibition, a violation, a reconnaissance, a delivery, trickery, complicity, villainy, and so forth. A journey and the which is really what interests me here and to discuss today, becomes a really important element of the story. The journey becomes a process of encounter, of resolution, and of deliverance. And that's why in many folk stories, we often see the hero going through a process by which they take a journey where they meet a number of characters that give them ideas or solutions, special powers, answers that can later be utilized in the return where the conflict typically is resolved. I have always been very interested as an educator in the process of the journey, not only because of the long tradition in education on peripatetic learning, but simply because I believe, as someone who belongs to the last analog generation, somebody who belongs to a generation that grew up before computers were widely available or before the internet was accessible to the world, has always been, as you may say, a hunter-gatherer type of of individual. In other words, whenever learning to me becomes a little bit about going to the thing and trying to understand it directly. I also come from a family of writers, and my older brother, who was a philosopher, uh, when I was very young, he would teach me literature and writing, and in particular, uh, he he taught me philosophy when I was very young, and without even knowing it, without being able to distinguish the difference between superheroes and Heidegger and Bergson and Marx and Hegel, I I started associating learning as a process of enjoyment and a process of discovery, and uh, that's why I have always been interested in the subject of ontology and hermeneutics. But to exemplify to you a little bit what this desire for peripatetic learning informs art making, I would like to speak about two projects that I have done in the past that uh, that not only involve that process of journey, but also in interesting ways connect with the subject that I previously presented on conflict and how art helps us process notions of conflict and trauma. The first story really starts in around 2001 in the Dalmatian coast. I was traveling on a train in the Dalmatian coast where I met a family who were perhaps originally from Croatia. And I, as I was speaking to one of the members of the family, a 16-year-old girl, and she learned that I was from Mexico, she started speaking to me in Spanish perfectly. It was very surprising to me that at this particular place, I will find somebody who was not from a Spanish-speaking country and yet could speak Spanish flawlessly. And I was very curious about how she had learned Spanish. And her response was pretty interesting to me. She said, I learned because I love Mexican soap operas and I watch them every day. That was the beginning of what became a really interesting puzzle to me, which was the impact that Latin American and specifically Mexican soap operas had in Eastern Europe. And doing a little bit of digging, I learned something particularly interesting about that story, which I will share here with you. In Mexico, there was a very popular soap opera produced in the 1970s, known as Los ricos también lloran, the rich also cry. The Mexican soap opera and the Latin American soap opera in general, especially this period, has a very specific format that is very close to the Cinderella story. In other words, there's usually a woman who is of lower class, and of course in Mexico is usually indigenous, and who has a dream of having a relationship with usually the son or like what would be the equivalent of the prince, I suppose. And it's an impossible love. In the case of Los Ricos También Lloran, it's exactly that. The maid, let's say, of the house, who is played by Veronica Castro here, falls in love with the son of the patriarch of a family of the house where she works. And it's an impossible love that after 300 or so episodes, of course, arrives to the resolution and a happy ending of a marriage between the both of them. But of course, that's what the whole soap opera is about. What was really interesting is that this soap opera that was very popular in the time when it was produced, later was basically shelved. And it was not until the end of communism in 1992 or so, when in the ex-Soviet Union, there was nothing to watch on TV, and they bought the rights to The Rich Also Cry, which was translated in Russian to Bogati Toshe Plachut. The soap opera was an enormous success, and the entire ex-Soviet Union watched that soap opera religiously. And in fact, on the last day of the transmission of the soap opera, they broke the record in the history of television of the amount of millions of individuals who watched that episode. To this day, the Rich Also Cry is still a very popular reference in Russia. And there's, in fact, a whole generation of individuals who have been named Mexican names, soap opera names. Some Russians still call their summer houses haciendas. And Veronica Castro is still a very famous and popular figure in Russia, who was in fact invited to the Kremlin by Boris Yeltsin at some point. The question really is, what is it that made this particular project or particular soap opera popular? And in fact, the soap opera structure, like those folk tales, has very specific prototypes or symbols and things that refer to problems and issues that indirectly are addressed in a collective sense. The interpretation of why this was such a successful and model for Eastern Europe in this particular period of after the fall of the Berlin Wall was that many of the conflicts that the soap opera spoke about that were unresolved within society helped them catalyze those unresolved feelings and questions, issues around inequity of race, inequity of gender, that during communism had been left largely unaddressed. This soap opera became this vehicle for the population to project themselves in seeing the resolution of those problems. And I was fascinated by how this commercial product, which is really a soap opera, which is also merged in a dramatic form, helped catalyze those feelings. I thus started what was one of my first social practice projects in my career that was titled El Instituto de la Telenovela, also known as Soap Opera Institute. The objective of this project was to study and research and present as an educational institution, basically, the impact of Mexican soap operas in Eastern Europe, of the way in which a developing country could have a hegemonic influence on the rest of the world, and also the way that it helped us catalyze conflict. Because the fact is that soap operas of this nature will be incredibly popular in places where conflict was going on, not just in Eastern Europe, but in places like Turkey, in places like Israel, places that have such a kind of an oppressive or feel or going through a difficult time socially or politically, that there's an enormous need for escapism. So that's exactly what Instituto de la Telenovela tried to do. And what the first location where we launched the project was in Ljubljana in Slovenia in 2002. And I designed the space in such a way that it really mimicked, let's say, a modernist Mexican household. The kind of colors that you see here, or you see in the space, there were colors that were basically impossible to find, or in downtown Ljubljana. And it offered the space offered typically the same hope or desire for escapism that soap operas themselves have. And so it was a place for respite, for escape, but also of reflection about what kind of world soap operas offer us. As a pedagogical project, it was important in that it invited individuals who were not necessarily, let's say, initiated in the world of contemporary art to become the knowledge base of a particular discussion. So in this particular version of the project, which was presented at the HDLU Contemporary Art Center in Zagreb, in Croatia, it was really interesting to see that it was mostly women who participated, and they were like non-artist women. They were like middle-aged women who watched soap operas, who come and attend the workshops, temporarily displacing let's say, the art intelligentsia of Zagreb, taking over this place where they could speak about their passion and their interest in soap operas. And the project did have, as I mentioned, this peripatetic component. It traveled to many different countries and many different cities where it would do specific research on the impact of or the history of soap operas in that particular place. And while the project happened mostly in Eastern Europe, it also happened to travel to La Habana in Cuba, which was a part of the Havana Biennial in 2004, and where we produced essentially a radio program, given that in Cuba, Cuba plays a very important historical role in the creation of the soap opera, mainly because before soap operas went into television, the dramatic model was based on the Cuban melodrama, radio drama. And the first famous soap opera was actually a old Cuban melodrama known as El Derecho de Nacer, the right to be born, which is the story of a black servant who supposedly has a white son, and has to it's basically, she inherits a baby, or she's given a baby by that's born out of wedlock by her master, and she has to take the baby away and raise him as her own real son. So it's another story that deals a lot with matters of race and class. What I did with this project in the Cuban version is we interviewed a lot of dramaturgs and radio writers from Cuba to discuss the origins of the dramatic origins of the soap opera in Cuba, that later, after the revolution, traveled to countries like Mexico and Venezuela, and inaugurated, let's say, the industry, or the modern industry of the soap opera. It became a project that allowed individuals in different countries to reflect on how stories catalyze and process the conflicts that they themselves have. And it opened also a larger discussion of how art in general, through stories, through experiences and so forth, allow us to understand those problems. The second project that also has a very pathetic component that I would like to speak about is it involves or it was perhaps triggered by the United States war on terror, quote unquote, after the 9/11 and leading to the United States invasion of Iraq, which I think most of us in the art world were very opposed to, because we felt it was a distortion of understanding what a conflict that we were living was about. And as a Mexican immigrant who lives in the United States, as an artist who lives in the United States, my interest, which has always been somewhat ethnographic, was turned to really understanding the historical reasons for this idea that the United States would pursue this notion that it was able to spread democracy around the world, which was then known as the Bush Doctrine. The historical precedences include Manifest Destiny, the idea that the United States was a country that was chosen by God to spread democracy, and which justified in a certain way the westward expansion, and which also justified the U.S.-Mexico War, and also the later precedent of the political role of the United States after the during the Cold War, which it was predicated in the Western Hemisphere as the good neighbor policy. The idea that the Western Hemisphere will remain a specific political force that would actually bring all these people, these countries together. It was a way by the United States to maintain political influence and make sure that communism will not spread into the Western Hemisphere. Interestingly and ironically, here's a poster that was actually made by my uncle Leon Helguera two generations ago in the 1940s, as he worked for the U.S. federal government to produce posters, and this is a poster about Latin American unity. So, but my interest really was to try to understand this idea that countries in the Americas could be seen as a unity, and also I should say during that time the notion of continental unity was important, because we were looking at what we saw the success of the European Union, and there were questions about like how is it that we cannot create something similar to the EU in the Americas, given that in the majority of Latin America we speak the same language, Spanish, and yet we cannot seem to be able to attain that sort of like continental integration. And this notion of Pan-Americanism was predicated by many important politicians and political thinkers, anywhere from Thomas Jefferson to Simon Bolivar. And yet it was a constant unrealized dream. I also was very interested in trying to understand how we saw nationality as a defining element of identity as artists. And the project that when I launched it, I first launched it in Zurich, in Switzerland of all places, so not in the Americas, as part of an exhibition that was about precisely ideas of peace. And this was in May of 2003, which was shortly before or around the time of the invasion of Iraq. And the way I imagined the project was as a schoolhouse that was more or less designed in the form of the 19th century country schoolhouses that existed in the United States, kind of like a very small community space within which I had structured a number of workshops where individuals could speak about notions of conflict and peace. And I will go back to talk about this moment, but there was the 2 years later, I came to the decision that if I really were to make this project fully, I needed to not simply do it in not in the Americas, of course, but in the physical territory of the Americas. And what I wanted to do was to do it physically. In other words, to drive the entirety of the Pan American Highway, which is around 20,000 miles, from Anchorage, Alaska to Ushuaia in Argentina, covering the entirety of what is really the largest and longest highway in the world, which is the Pan American Highway. I wanted to have those interactions directly. I wanted to learn by doing in the traditional notion of pragmatism. And I felt that this could only be done if I would physically travel to those locations and go through the physical journey of travel. And similarly, my training as an educator led me to create this type of structure where we would arrive to the site, identify topics of discussion for a public event, have a panel about it, and then a workshop where we would discuss those issues. So it had all the markings and all the elements of an education initiative, really. And to me, it was really important to actually have a physical structure of the schoolhouse present. This is the tent version of the schoolhouse that I traveled with all the way to Ushuaia. That has the bell and it was completely collapsible, and it will go into a van that I had bought in Anchorage with the help of a grant, and basically I would drive down the highway with my schoolhouse to do those encounters and workshops. We would show videos of the Americas, and the project had quite a range of elements. Which included one-on-one interviews and large encounters. The very first interview was with Mary Smith Jones, who was the last speaker of IAC, which is a native language of the state of Alaska. And it was quite a meaningful encounter to meet with Chief Marie, who regaled us with stories about her community, and whose name, in fact, in IAC means the voice that I follow. This project is so much about site, about location, about the romanticism of travel, and the way that it connects historically with those people who traveled through the Americas to make discoveries, to do research, to understand its culture, and the way in which communities also with cultures within the Americas have traveled, influencing one another. At the locations where I would travel after the workshop, we started creating declarations that the individuals that were participating in those workshops would write. I would tell them or give them the task of doing a text that would represent them as citizens of that particular city and as artists of that particular city, identifying the challenges and problems that they saw wherever they were, and declaring what they would do to solve them. And this became a really important aspect of the project that allowed individuals to describe themselves and see themselves in a proactive manner as people who just do not try to critique, but also to act on what they had learned. It's also important to mention that this was like one of the last projects before the age of social media. So we were disseminating this information in blogs, and I was very diligently at the end of every single day, trying to find an internet cafe somewhere, which is what we were using at the time, to post on my blog what had happened on that particular day, like a journalist. And the project will be followed over the months, the 4 months that it lasted. by those that were a part of the project and those who were simply interested in following the aspects of the project. So the project really took a wide variety of forms, and it's important to know that it had also it played a lot with the parafiction of nationalism. I wrote a Pan American anthem. I composed this music that will be sung as an anthem. And there were also, of course, the pragmatics of the project. The fact that my relationship to the to the project was so much about being able to drive down the highway, which I have to confess, I hate driving. I am not a driver, and I'm not. It's not something that has always anyone any time has been of interest to me, and yet there I was, like my job most of the time having to drive. So the other thing was that this project fulfilled, in my view, aspects of education programming in museums that I always felt were insufficient in the institution of the museum. In other words, the museums are very static institutions that only serve an immediate community, and their presence is mostly virtual. Here I was kind of like doing a type of outreach that will be inconceivable for any arts organization, and yet I was simply a guy with, I always said, with a van and a blog, who was simply going to various locations to have these workshops. And this is where I think it's an important aspect that I want to talk about the project that I think is important or topical to this conversation, and it's like my role in the School of Pan-American Rest as a trained educator was eminently very self-effacing. I was not interested in speaking about myself. I was not interested in making this project about myself. I wanted to make this project about the publics that the project was interacting with, and it was really focused on those collective statements. In some places, especially after I crossed the border in Mexico and went into other countries, it started to become much more contested, and individuals were not necessarily happy to simply talk about their own conflicts. And in fact, many times they did not want art to be a source of conflict resolution. In fact, they only wanted art, in some cases, as a form of escapism. And this was particularly true of El Salvador, where in one of the conversations that I had with the local artists in El Salvador, who had gone through a terrible, brutal civil war in the 1980s, saw art not as a way of gaining understanding, but more like a way to really escape from reality. And that was one of the issues that I contended with as an artist. And then the second issue really dealt with my role, as I mentioned before, as them wanted me to be more like the traditional professor or teacher, to talk to them about the art that was in places like New York. They saw the school as simply a traditional school that would teach them, or that what I would in a top-down fashion just teach them about art. And instead of a collective platform where we will produce knowledge together. So that was one of the issues that I contended with a lot of times. So in the project, I played a number of roles, and that was both a organizer. Sometimes somebody called me the Pan-American therapist, because I was collecting so many stories in the places where I traveled. And I also had to deal with like the logistics of travel through like all of Latin America. Colombia being one of the most interesting and difficult moments of the trip, particularly as I arrived or closer to the Venezuelan border in Cucuta, where a bus crashed onto my van, and I was pretty much stuck into in the border of Venezuela and Colombia and not being able to cross. Another instance where my personal journey was starting to be impossible to avoid. Like my personal experiences were impossible to separate from the programming, let's say, of the school. In Caracas, the debates were really interesting because we were in the second re-election of Hugo Chavez at the time, and during that period, the debates, the anti-U.S. debates were very strong. So half of the participants saw this project very negatively in that it represented American imperialism, and the other half saw it very positively because it kind of represented Bolivarianism, which was the idea that Bolivar himself had on the idea of like an integrated Americas. It also was a very meaningful project in the countries that that typically don't receive a lot of international attention, such as Paraguay, which is a really beautiful and very rich, culturally rich country that speak Spanish and Guarani. Most people are bilingual there, and where some of the encounters and interactions with communities were most meaningful. And this was an example where I learned that when we are needed the most as artists is where we should be. In other words, like we have this desire for recognition and attention in major art exhibitions. However, it is the places that are most abandoned that I think where the role of the artist becomes more important. And I will not go into much detail into like this project. This is a very extensive project that, of course, I mentioned covered so much ground and thousands of hours of interactions. Suffice to say that I did arrive to the end of the world, quote unquote. It's not quote unquote. It's actually the end of the world. This is the southernmost inhabited part in the world, before Antarctica, and this is Puerto Williams in Chile. It's a military base, and that is across the Beagle Channel, which separates Argentina and Chile. And this island where Puerto Williams is called Isla Navarino. And at the end of the last road, in the last house of the southernmost part in the world, is the place where the last speaker of Yagan lived. Her name was Cristina Calderón, and she was, as I mentioned, the last speaker of the Yagan people of Tierra del Fuego. And so this very large project ended kind of like a fairy tale. The journey ends in a fairy tale with a conversation, as it had started with a conversation with the last speaker of IAC. And it was perhaps an anticlimactic, but not less meaningful moment for me, as I try to understand cultural specificity as part of this project. And like many projects that we all undertake as individuals, as artists, the question really is like, why did we do it? So first, I think I need to say, and this is more like now close to summarize my presentation, which are the two defining factors of or things that relate to the subject I want to speak about today. One is the personal role of the artist in the production of artistic dialogue, and my training as an educator has always told me that I need to set my personality aside, and that I need to focus on the interaction. I need to focus on the discussion and the conversation with individuals. However, at times it's impossible to make those separations. And the second thing that I wanted to say is that in specifically in being able to separate the art from the personal, my brother, who who I mentioned, who was my first teacher, he passed away on the very first, on the week where I launched the Pan American Project, which led me, now that I think retrospectively, to the trip. As some of you might know, whenever you experience trauma, when you experience a sense of loss, individuals usually go on a long trip. And this ties back to the notion of the fairy tale, the idea that we embark on large journeys that are transformative, and the process of the journey is kind of like an artistic process. It's a process of discovery that involves a journey into the unknown, into the not knowing. The key is coming to terms with the discomfort of not always knowing what we will encounter, and be prepared to meet and learn from those new experiences as we share them with our public. The artist thus works and communicates not to others, but with others. And that to me is the key of how the process of art making is both a process of knowing, not knowing, and discovery. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. This was wonderful end of a fruitful morning, but we still would like to, I'm sure there are some questions that we would like to pose you. So I would like to give you the opportunity to connect with Pablo.
May I have my question is how you worked inside the museum, and so it's connected also.
I am sorry, but I cannot hear absolutely anything. I'm so sorry. Can somebody type the question in the chat? I hear absolutely nothing. So sorry.
Carlo, can you chat with Pablo? If you pose the question, you can pose
your
the
microphone.
question.
Your microphone is also not very clear.
Or come here. Do you hear me, Pablo?
I can barely hear your microphone.
So Carlo,
it's
if
really,
you can,
it's completely muffled. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. So Pablo, sorry, Carlo, if you can write the question in the chat to Pablo, then we can connect.
So the question is, you are an artist working in a museum. Does the artist fit properly inside it? First, you mentioned in an interview that art is an outsider. Well, what I would say first, I'm no longer an artist in a museum, thankfully. I was an artist who worked in museums for approximately 29 years. And it was to a certain extent, it was a symbiotic relationship. And in that I felt that museums can benefit from the perspective of the practitioner, and the practitioner can benefit from observing how art is presented to audiences, and how art is not this self-indulgent, and it should not be this self-indulgent practice, but a real public engagement with the world. And in that sense, I think it's very helpful for those who are artists to really understand what the public process is about, and it's also very helpful for those who work in institutions to see how art is not this magical or spiritual practice, but a very real and a tangible one that we engage in, and but ultimately the two practices are very separate and very and feel not compatible. But I can certainly say that all the projects that I've done are informed by what I learned working within museums, and I think that the art world in general needs to use its needs to modify structures to better reflect the way that the art practice works today.
Thank you. Is there another question? Jordi? In the chat. Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise, Pablo cannot hear.
Ok. Pablo, ¿me oyes? No. Can you hear me, Pablo?
No, I cannot.
Should I go to the chat? It will take me a lot. Okay, so I will try. So I will try to be short, but well, I'm working in Manifesta in the education department, and Pablo was a super inspiration for us. So during the mediation school, we read a few texts from him, and it's interesting because some of our mediators are, they also have an artist practice, they are artists too. What kind of recommendation, now that Manifesta is finishing now, what kind of recommendation can Pablo give to all these young professionals that just discover cultural mediation, art mediation, and that they are developing their first projects? So what kind of tip or recommendation can give them with all his experience? Can you chat something like so long like this? I'm sorry. Wow, you're amazing. Yeah, basically, it's what kind of recommendation he can give to young professionals in our mediation.
So the question, as I understand it, is what kind of recommendations I can give to young professionals that have discovered the art world with the experience of Manifesta, right?
Not the art world, but the art mediation world, let's say.
Well, I did not speak about this much, but I believe that the world of arts mediation comes from very traditional understandings of what education is. What I encountered in my early years in working in museums was that the understanding of what education was two things: was like working with children, doing with crayons, and explaining great ideas about art as if it was information that you take from a cereal box and try to have people memorize that information. That is not mediation. Those are like 18th century ideas of education. And I think what's really important is to really see education as a contemporary experimental art practice that is really about producing knowledge and that has to respond in the same way that contemporary art responds to contemporary practices, that education has to respond and incorporate cognitive practices of the 21st century. And it is always been very interesting to me that even though we support artistic practices that are very varied, and we embrace all sorts of technologies, all sorts of conceptual practices, yet we think about education as like a single type of recipe that goes back to 3 centuries ago. So it is very important to see education as a living and an organic and discipline that is also a discipline that requires a lot of understanding and knowledge. It's not simply about giving out information top down, and that's why I believe that artists who work in bringing together education and the artistic practice can be really interesting. But I think that what biennials and the art projects that Manifesta offer us is the possibility of experimentation, is the possibility of reimagining systems and models that are not dependent of a single structure of either a museum or a building or a government. It's a place of imagining new models and pilot new possibilities. So I think that as artists and as public, it's really wonderful to experience this type of projects that can help us then model and produce projects that can help reimagine like permanent institutions.
Absolutely. Amazing, because I think this reply is perfect for our last panel tomorrow in the afternoon. We will take all these considerations that Pablo just said. But I think, I don't know if there is more questions.
Maybe one more question, and then because we're a bit delayed, then we can continue tomorrow.
Carlo, I tried to cut it short. The question is, Pablo spoke about in his project in 2006 in El Salvador, that his experience was he didn't experience that the people in El Salvador whom he met didn't see art as a conflict resolution, but as an escape from reality. This was 2006. Now we are 15, 16 years later. How does he reflect upon culture, not only artistic interventions, but culture as a conflict resolution in Lebanon, in Palestine, in areas as Ukraine?
I think that the sentiment that I heard in El Salvador about the relationship with art with art as something that will help them escape is perennial. It's not just something specific to El Salvador, of course, and I think that I think it's something that I myself relate to. Like many times when you are living conflict daily, you just want to deal with it anymore. You want to find ways in which you can think of something else, and I remember during the pandemic, in fact, how many occasions I encountered people who just only wanted to talk about art. They did not want to talk anymore about the virus or talk about the COVID anymore. Soap operas are another example. They are stories that help you and in quote unquote escape. The important thing to think about, however, as we are artists or as we produce these type of projects, is that those conflicts do not go away. That just by escaping, you think you're simply not dealing with a problem, and that's why soap operas are so interesting, because they help you deal with the problem through storytelling in a very kind of subconscious ways. So what's important to remember is, number one, the collective desire for escapism, the desire for not having to confront a problem directly, and also the fact that nevertheless we want to deal with that problem in a subconscious manner. So art that helps you catalyze those issues, perhaps in indirect ways, is one of the important aspects of the craft of art making. And those of us who work in this realm need to be conscious of those desires. And I encountered that also in the Pan American Project, where, for example, in Colombia, when I was discussing with my hosts what we wanted to talk about, the last thing everybody wanted to talk about was about violence as a result of the civil war in Colombia, which at the time was still very strong. The FARC, the civil war in Colombia lasted for decades. So the last thing they wanted to talk about was about violence. They instead wanted to talk about museums. So I said, oh, fine, we'll just talk about museums. We'll have a conversation about cultural patrimony and such. The day before the panel, somebody stole my computer and all my belongings in the hotel. And the day after the day of the panel, we were only talking about violence in Colombia, and it was not really the reason for the conversation or the presented context, but it became the context of the conversation. In other words, like you cannot escape conflict, and you cannot escape your desire of processing that conflict, and in any case, I think it's as artists, it's incumbent upon us to find ways in which we can address it, and that we can address it not in confrontational ways, but in ways that allow us to, through fiction, through games, through leisure activities, through poetics, to really try to help individuals see themselves from different perspectives. Fairy tales do that.
Frankly, I think that's a beautiful end, finalizing with fairy tales, because this is all about stories and fairy tales. I think I would like to thank you so much, Pablo, for your presence, for your inputs. I'd like to thank all the panelists and the moderator for this morning's contributions.